So let's talk about the story of guns in America. It's a really fascinating and, complicated history. And it's a story that's not just about the guns themselves, but about how technology, culture, and the law have all grown up together, constantly shaping one another over the centuries.
And our story doesn't even start with a gun. It starts with an idea, a revolutionary idea about how to make things that would completely change America and eventually the entire world.
And this idea, this system, it wasn't some happy accident. It was actually born from a government-led push that ended up setting the stage for America's really unique relationship with firearms.
So what are we talking about here? Well, you can think of it as the granddaddy of the modern assembly line, the whole concept of mass production, where every single part is identical and can be easily swapped out. And the one industry that kickstarted all of this, you guessed it, firearms.
Now, what's absolutely wild is that this didn't just bubble up from the free market. Nope, this was a deliberate top-down effort. The U.S. War Department was basically acting like a 19th century venture capitalist and an open-source tech hub, all rolled into one. They created the demand, they funded the R&D, and then they shared all the secrets.
I mean, just think about that for a second. In the span of a single human generation, gun-making went from something out of the Middle Ages to something we'd recognize today. That isn't just progress. That's a mind-blowing technological leap, and it happened way before we had mass markets for things like cars or appliances.
So you've got all this incredible new manufacturing power. What happens when it breaks out of the military and gets unleashed on the civilian world? Well, that's our next chapter, and it's mostly thanks to one man, the incredibly savvy Samuel Colt.
Before Colt came along, handguns were, well, they were kind of a gamble. They were finicky, expensive, unreliable toys for rich people. Mostly. Colt completely flipped the script. He used this new American system to mass produce a gun that was reliable, could fire multiple shots, and was simple and cheap enough for an ordinary person to buy and use.
But here's the thing about Colt. He wasn't just a brilliant manufacturer, he was an absolute marketing genius. He didn't just sell you a piece of metal. No, he sold you an idea. He got his foot in the door with a big army contract, and then he turned to the public, marketing his revolvers with these heroic ads about self-defense and freedom. He was literally embedding gun ownership into American culture.
And the scale we're talking about here is just staggering. The Civil War put his factories into overdrive, almost 500,000 revolvers made in just a few years. All that production didn't just arm soldiers, it created a massive surplus that flooded the country after the war, pouring even more fuel on this new gun culture.
Okay, so the guns themselves are getting super advanced, right? The mechanics are leaping into the future. But there was a huge problem. The stuff that actually made them go bang was basically ancient technology. And that was putting the US military in a really dangerous spot.
This quote just says it all, doesn't it? A smoke puff the size of a cow. On a battlefield, that's not just a problem, it's a death sentence. You're basically putting up a giant neon sign that says, "Hey everyone, I'm over here. Shoot at this giant cloud."
The new smokeless powder coming out of Europe wasn't just a little better, it was a total game changer. I mean, look at this. No giant smoke cloud, your gun doesn't get clogged up in jam, and it's way, way more powerful. It basically made black powder obsolete for military use overnight.
And in this brand new arms race, America was dead last, just completely behind the curve, happy with its old Civil War tech. And this all came to a head in 1898. When American soldiers ran headfirst into Spanish troops carrying modern, smokeless Mauser rifles. It was a brutal, bloody wake-up call.
So that wake-up call forced the US military to modernize, fast. But as weapons kept getting more powerful, more automatic, another major player entered the game. And that was the federal government, with significant regulation.
And what finally pushed them to act? It wasn't a foreign enemy. It was right here at home. You had prohibition, organized crime, and gangsters with military-grade weapons like the Tommy gun lighting up city streets. The public was terrified, and they demanded that the federal government do something.
So, the Roosevelt administration had a dilemma. They wanted to regulate these guns, but they were worried that an outright ban would be struck down as unconstitutional. So they got clever. Instead of banning them, they used a power nobody could argue with, the power to tax.
This law, the NFA, was really specific. It went right after the gangster weapons, machine guns, sawed-off shotguns. And that $200 tax, in 1934, that was an insane amount of money, like thousands and thousands of dollars today. It was designed to price these guns out of reach. It's also really interesting that handguns were almost on that list, but they were taken out. This act really laid the foundation for all federal gun laws that came after.
All right, let's jump forward to our modern era. In the last few decades, the whole conversation has kind of shifted. It's become less about what kind of guns people can own and much more about where they're allowed to carry them.
And to really get what's happening now, you have to understand the past. For most of American history, nearly every state had strict laws against carrying concealed weapons in public. This historical fact has become a crucial piece of the puzzle in today's legal battles.
And this chart just shows you how dramatically things have changed, and how fast. What used to be the exception is now the rule. A majority of states have moved to what's called permitless carry. That means in those states, you can carry a concealed handgun in public without a permit, and often without things like a background check or safety training.
So, the huge question is, what happens when you change these laws? Well, it is a subject of intense debate, to say the least. One comprehensive study, which organizations like Giffords often highlight, found a pretty significant link. It suggested that when states weakened their carry laws, they saw a 13 to 15% jump in violent crime over what would have been predicted.
And this all leads us to a massive Supreme Court decision in 2022. The Bruin ruling totally changed the game for Second Amendment law. It basically said that for any modern gun law to be constitutional, it has to match the country's history and tradition. So all that history we've just been talking about, it's suddenly more relevant and more fiercely debated than ever before.
So you see this cycle, right? A new technology comes along, which changes the culture, and then the law has to race to catch up. From government-funded factories to smokeless powder to these huge legal battles over the right to carry, the story of the gun in America is one of constant evolution. And it really makes you wonder, what's the next turn in the road going to look like? Because one thing is for sure, this story is far from over.